Bonjour à tous. Bonjour à tous. On va évoquer l'immigration et
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about immigration. This is the subject which is of interest to us today. There are several ways of looking at this. It's a political issue. It's a very difficult question to assess. There's a lot of economics at stake, particularly for different countries where they're not making babies anymore. So we've got to keep things moving. It's a question of public financing. It's a problem of accommodation, unemployment. And with that question, which has never been decided upon, whether immigration is chosen or imposed upon. This is linked to the climate, of course, as well. There's migration because of climate change. We're going to be talking about two major subjects today. The scope of migration, which is a real component of demographics today in rich countries, and the consequences of immigration on society and the destination countries. So with us today to enjoy this, to run this session, we've got Hippolyte Dalbis, who's the coordinator. He's worked very hard in preparing this section. We will be talking to the following people. We've got the former president of Amnesty International, who is with us, based in London and in Brussels, and Anjhula is a psychologist, and she specializes in trauma. Dr. Anjhula MYA SINGH-BAIS is her name. We've also got Christopher CALDWELL with us, a journalist at the New York Times, and editor of the Claremont Review of Books, Najat de Vallaud-Belkacem, president of France Terre d'Asile, a French association which supports people seeking asylum, based in Paris. And Najat was a politician also, and she has been in charge of several ministries under François Hollande. We've got Silvia, Elena, GIORGULI, SAUCEDO, who is with us from the College of Mexico, a higher education unit which specializes in human sciences and is based in Mexico. And Silvia has carried out research into international migration in the Americas. And finally, we've got Philip Luck, director of the CSIS economics program, which is a Center for Strategic International Studies. It's a think tank founded in '62 within the University of Georgetown in Washington. To open this second session, I'm going to hand the floor immediately to Hippolyte Dalbis from the Circle des Économistes. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on migration. It's absolutely obvious, I'm just repeating, that migration is the subject of debate and of conflict also. And at the Cercle des Économistes, we thought that in order to come out with our heads held high and have a constructive debate, then we're going to have to get back to the facts. It's very interesting when you're talking about migration to know that those who are for and those who are against it accuse the other party of not telling the truth, of denying what's really going on. Typically, the opponents to immigration will say that their opponents are looking through rose-tinted spectacles, they don't see the reality, whereas those who are for immigration will say that their opponents are over-dramatizing, etc., etc. What I would like to do in this short introduction is to say that we can get beyond that, we can move on. And those who are for, those who are against, will often come together when they're looking at the facts.
In fact, they will have the same vision of reality or immigration, but their interpretation thereof is different. Let me give you 4 examples. First fact, if I could say so, it's almost like obvious. First fact is that immigration is something positive for the individuals who migrate. Well, the migrant will experience a gain higher than that of migration. There is a gain for the individual. And I would say everybody agrees on that, but those in favor of immigration or support migrants say, okay, we need to help them. And those who are against it, well, they say, well, they come and take advantage of the social benefits in our system. So there is a gain. So when there will be a difference in disagreement in the discussion, it's on the effect of this immigration on the other population, that is of the receiving countries. Well, say that will have a negative impact or a positive impact. A lot of research has been done, and we can discuss that. Second fact, which is cannot be debated, well, at least pro and anti-immigration may find broad agreement, is the plus of the immigrations. If the person is highly qualified and integrated in the society, well, it will have a positive contribution to the new society or the hosting society. This applies to people who migrate, and for those who were already there. Once you enlarge your social network and you have skills, the more you're likely to enjoy. They'll appreciate that. And to have, everybody will agree that integration is key. Then the political issue, the debate is, are we going to implement public policies to help people who come in order to enable them to fully integrate into the hosting societies? And sometimes we in denial say if we do nothing well for people to integrate themselves, well, it is then complicated to blame them a posteriori for not being integrated, because they're not being integrated and they don't contribute. Third fact, which also to be found in every country of the world, regardless of their position for or against immigration, all countries of the world want to keep their citizens. Very few people will block population from leaving the country. So what do we need to do? Well, if you want to keep your young population, if you want to avoid the brain drain, or if you want to, at the level of city or of a region, where you need to have attractive policies, you have to make sure that individuals, citizens who are in a specific location, should clearly, enjoy a proper, fruitful life. So this notion of creativity, the attractiveness, but this, of course, it will also trigger attractiveness outside, and they may trigger immigration or a wish for immigration. Last point, which I think is of importance, is that everybody, pros or against, want to attract talents. We want to have the future entrepreneur who find a new vaccine, a new chip, a new AI system, whatever, high tech or whatever, So everybody wants, are we going to receive or not these talents? You want the best. Then the opposition say, okay, well, no, because let's keep only the talents, and we'll do a sorting, we'll sort, and the others say, well, you need a more generous policy, because if you want to say, okay, we don't want you, but we want only the good ones, where the good ones might not want to go. So lots of common points, the denial of reality, which is often, from the opponent or the partisans, often it's against foundations, but you have to rely on facts to have a constructive debate. So, Madame Singh-BAIS, you have okay, Singh-BAIS, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Is my mic working? It's working. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, and I want to start off by saying thank you to the audience for joining in such heat. I live in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and if I'm finding France very warm, I think that is saying something. But actually, it ties in. One of the biggest reasons for migration right now, and that will increase in the future, is climate change. And I think, this panel is very interesting because we're approaching the debate on migration from many angles. I don't think that's done enough. As an international psychology trauma specialist, I work with lawyers, court cases, policy, from a human rights perspective, and of course, individuals and families that are migrating and that are thinking about migrating. And there is something to be said about the psychology of sort of social proof and groupthink. I think a lot of times in the media and the narrative and clickbait and fear-mongering, what are we doing but repeating politicians' narratives? They will spin it and say that they are responding to their constituents, their voters' concerns, but actually we're looking around and going, gosh, everybody's saying this is a problem, it must be a problem. I don't agree. Sort of psychologically speaking, emotionally, when you have fear, you close down. When you have positivity and hope, you expand. And I'm asking the audience and all of us to think about who do we really want to be as opposed to being told who we want to be. Quite often, it'll be said that Europe has a problem with migration and it's closed and that's the narrative. Maybe, but I think we need to be critical thinkers. And I think to what you were saying, is it a choice or is it sort of imposed on us? Everything is a choice. When you're talking about, it's also a choice not to do something. When you're talking about reality, to me, it's very interesting as a psychologist, we're almost talking about reality as an objective truth out there and not taking responsibility and accountability that we create our own reality. So, it truly is the power of the people. And I always say as a psychologist, feelings don't equal facts, they're valid, but we must construct sort of counter narratives of all the fear-mongering. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And I'd be cautious, as a Global South leader and a psychologist about having a narrative that's a savior mentality. We're taking them in, we're helping, not realizing how much, on average, people who migrate, how much they lift the host country. And both, there's a debate to be had also about the host country and the country of origin, how much they lose, how much they gain emotionally, fiscally, politically. And I started my opening remarks with climate. I'll just say that if we focus just on climate for one of the main drivers of migration, then without a doubt, we can't look at our neighbors and say that's somebody else's problem, it's everyone's problem. So I'll stop there.
Merci, Anjhula. Je passe la parole.
I will now give the floor to Christopher Caldwell, a journalist and as a Tribune in New York Times. We'll talk about demographic growth expected in sub-Saharan Africa and the impact on migration into Europe. Thank you for your hospitality. Very happy to be here with you. I think I quite agree with Mrs. Singh-BAIS. When we talk about immigration, we tend to pay more attention to some, or to accept some ideological explanations, such as Islam is about to conquer Europe. And those explanations can be true, can be false, but I think most of the time, the true explanation has to do with demography. They have to deal with population, and in that respect, I think when we talk about encounter, except for the US-China meeting where we talk about the military economic domains, I think there is no global meeting or encountering which would have heavier consequences for the future than that of Europe and Africa, the face-to-face situation, because demographic growth in Africa is just formidable, and I think very few people clearly grasp the scope of this migration that will follow. Basically, we can say that the population of Africa as a whole will double between now and 2075. So we may think about Niger. Niger is a country. I took Niger because it's we see it on TV. It often makes the headline on French newspapers. But in Niger, there are two In 1960, it was there was 2.5 million inhabitants. It was basically smaller than Ireland. It was like a Baltic country, whereas now there are 30 million inhabitants. And there is still a demographic growth, and therefore, in the middle of this century, there will be 70 to 80 million inhabitants. A country like France. We can talk about the city of Lagos, for example, in Nigeria, which had, well, 50 years ago, they were 300,000 inhabitants. It was like Nice or Nantes. Now it's larger than the Netherlands altogether. So the scale is amazing, this demographic growth. And this will change Europe because Europe is short in labor. So how many people will come from Africa? And if I take into consideration those issues, I would tend to rely on this author. He was an American journalist who writes in French, strangely enough, but anyway. And he wrote a book which I consider as a masterpiece, which is The Rush to Europe, or Scramble to Europe. Well, he had a very interesting anecdote to do kind of assessment for Africa. I noted that in the 50s, in 1950s that is, he talks about, he makes a comparison with the immigration from the US, from the Mexico, sorry, in the US. In 50s, it was noted that US needed the Mexican labor. How many will come? That was the question. And most people said that there will be just a minute fraction of the population of Mexico, which at the time had something like 30 million inhabitants. In fact, now there are 40 million Mexicans in the US. So immigration may exceed what is actually expected, and that would tend to think that I think the immigration coming from Africa, the number would be more like tens or hundreds of millions. Thank you, Christopher. And I give the floor to Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, who talks about the perspective on exile based on experience and viewpoints from refugees. Good afternoon. I'd like to react, before talking about refugees, to what Hippolyte Dalby said, because I find that very relevant to say, okay, so on what point can we agree in a neutral, objective way? Well, in fact, the last point you mentioned, you said, or the penultimate, opponents and pros or against, it's better to have integration than to have no integration. Fair enough. But the problem is very theoretical, this scheme or pattern, because once that's said, or we could say, then fair enough, okay, great, so let's have a consensus conference in France, we love that, let's have people, pros and against, and let them work together around this issue of integration, and we come up with that for 5 years. We will push for integration policies, but it doesn't work. Why? Because those who are against immigration, because they rely on the myth of the aspiration process, the country is so attractive, this is why people come, because they know that they will have amazing conditions of life, it's a myth which has been, proven false by research. Well, as they rely on that, especially the asylum seekers, because they want to enjoy the social system, Well, they do not want to have public integration policies because the public integration policy would facilitate life and would send signal that it is nice, pleasant to be here. So this is the way the opponents actually would rather have let people in the street, give them no housing, not learn the language of the country. They don't get jobs because that serves their purpose or their narratives. And they come here only because there has been a kind of an aspiration process, or, you know. And I'm here, I suppose, in this panel because with Benjamin Michel, we published a book called Refugees, What You Are Not Being Told, which comes back to this issue. So what do you talk about refugees? We're talking about migration policies as a whole. Well, I talk about refugees because what I observed in the last few years is that the problem with the problem of the reluctance towards newcomers, which was more the economic, view as the economic migrant, in the last few years, it's turned to the asylum seeker, the refugee. It's counterintuitive because in the mind of many people, we think that no, refugees different, it's noble, we still, because we humanistic want to protect them, this is not what is unpleasant for public opinion. Well, quite actually, since the arrival of Syrians in Europe, everything that followed, and the rise of populism, which pushed for this, well, it is the asylum seekers that are blamed, and especially the angle, they're not here because they flee from persecution, or well, they're here just for economic reasons and they're lying. So it's essential to look at this topic, to understand what is at stake, and to enlighten people to know exactly who are the asylum seekers, where do they come from, and to tell you things that are no longer mentioned in the public debate. When people flee their country, their preference, I talk a lot with refugees and asylum seekers. Well, if you ask them on their true preference, they would rather, go in a country next to theirs because, because they flee persecution, terror, arbitrary detention, but they would love to see their family, or, see if you're a Syrian or an Afghan woman. The preference would be to be next door, basically, to their country of origin. But the problem is that country next to theirs, because it's in the south usually, do they have the means, including economic means, to help these people to receive the refugees? So, and how can we help them? How can we provide the fundings for such situations? So, in fact, in this world today, everything is poorly organized. We start from the idea that people who flee from terror are liars, are frauds. Well, this Syrians came to Europe 10 years ago. Now, just imagine, what they've heard for the last 10 years. 10 years later, when we opened the prisons in Bashar al-Assad, and cameras finally can film what were the torture rooms and the cells. That's what they were running away from. It was hard. Well, it's about bloody time. So, to see that. So, we tend to we introduce some kind of confusion in public debate, which is very problematic. I've heard 1,000 times, which means we give high figures by saying, okay, well, do you realize we give almost 400,000 residence permit per year? It's huge. And in these major figures, when in fact we mix everything, foreign students, workers, mixed couples, refugees, well, out of those figures, we only have the image of the asylum seeker on a boat about to sink in the Mediterranean. All those manipulations have to be dismantled. Could we stop the misunderstanding between migration from students and the workers and asylum seekers, you know, people who are forced out of their countries. The first part, you know, the students represent 30% of residence permits, whereas asylum seekers 12%. So the first part is made of voluntary migrants, and it makes our country, this can be regulated by our country. We can do that. We can regulate based on our own interest, our own needs, to say, okay, we don't need so many students, we need more skilled workers. So why don't we do it? Why don't we have this story about sort of a impossibility, so which fuels these wrong ideas? Well, of course, there are principles mean that we have to accept asylum seekers, to listen to see if they are refugees or not. But first, remember that they do not represent that many people. Last year, 130,000 people came to as asylum seekers in France. Among them, 70,000 have been accepted. And if you compare that to 78 million citizens, and second, and I'll close on that, but asylum seeking is something very precious, which cannot be dismantled by people who reject immigrants. So the asylum seekers is a Geneva Convention in 1951, and they were, you know, that was adopted by because of the Jews fleeing from Germany. So as you know, this finished in the concentration camp. So the 1951 Geneva Convention is to say, let's not do that happen again, not again, never again. You know, we have to stop this violence. So this is what talk about asylum seekers. When someone says on TV, say it's too complicated to initial text or decrease or no, well, think if maybe it's worth preserving this heritage.
Va nous parler de ces pays d'émigration.
We're now going to hear from Silvia, Elena, GIORGULI, Sakuri.
And think on Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's what I'm going to talk about from a demographic perspective. And I hope that this global perspective also helps us to build a new and a different narrative around migration. So right now what we have in Latin America is an increase in intra-regional migration that has blurred the notion or the distinction between country of origin, country of destination, country of transit, country of return. No? Now in many and most of the countries you can find either of these flows. And this is related to new challenges in the management of migration. A region that in the second half of the last century was seen mainly as a region of origin, with a large south to north migration, especially to the US. The US is the big magnet, but with Europe as a second destination, now is changing to a region with a rapid increase in the size and with a rapid change in the direction of the flows. And there's one very clear example. In 10 years, more than 7 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela, which is about a third of the population. And it happened in just 10 years. No? That's the best example. And most of the Venezuelans stayed in Latin America, in the neighboring countries. So what we have been seeing, it's within this new pattern, first, heterogeneity of destinations. As I mentioned, a rapid change in the direction and the size of the flows, but also a diversification and a mix on the causes of migration. No? At the end of last centuries, when we talk about Latin American migration, we were mainly talking about economic or labor migration. And what we have now is a mixture of economic and labor migration, still persistent, with a large component of family reunification related to prior flows, with climate-related migration, for example, related to droughts and to hurricanes, but also with a large component driven by insecurity, organized crime events, and social violence, which is a form of forced migration, and which is related to the failure of the rule of law, which also poses a question on how to deal migration and how to reduce migration from the perspective of the countries of origin. It's not only an economic-driven migration, but it has to do what is happening at the local level with this failure of the rule of law. And we have several examples. If you look at the flows, for example, Ecuador, Honduras, El Salvador, even in Mexico, you see switches, rapid switches in the number of migrants related to large events due to organized crime acts or drug dealing, for example. The other thing that we have seen is a diversification of the profile of migrants. We were used to the young adult who was moving to find better economic opportunities, and now what we are seeing more and more is the whole family units with very young children moving along with their parents or with other relatives. And that poses a large challenge in terms of the management of migration, because our policy frameworks are not designed to respond to the needs and to the situation of the family units, and especially of the young migrants that come along with other relatives. Of course, it's very difficult to anticipate what will happen in the region. The region is already going through an aging process. Many of the countries are already decreasing in terms of size, and still migration flows are constant. We have a large challenge of being coherent in our own management of migration regarding what we expect of the management of the migration flows of our populations abroad, and that's a big challenge. And the other question that has a little to do with what Chris is saying is, well, what's the impact when you have 1/4 or 1/3 of your population living abroad? No? That would be the cases of Jamaica, El Salvador. In the case of Mexico, it's less than 8%. I don't know if 8% of the population is too much or not. I think that the region is at a certain point where we have an opportunity to build a new narrative, to build a regional response towards a safe, orderly, and regular management of migration. Of course, with some disadvantages, such as the weakness of multilateralism and regionalism in the case of Latin America, and also because of this contamination of the migration agenda with other agendas, such as the train agenda, the foreign train agenda, or with other issues related to security or to foreign policies. I think what I'm trying to do with this short intervention of first remarks is to try first to bring the perspective of sending a region that has been traditionally a region of sending migrants, out migration, to try to bring the discussion for the management of migration based on facts, empirically driven, and not necessarily on notions that do not have data that support them. And third, in a moment of change where we have this very strange situation where we are in fact a region of destination with no prior experience on social inclusion or social integration, weak state institutions regarding social welfare, and so those are some of the challenges that the region is facing right now.
Merci, Silvia, Elena.
Thank you very much, Silvia, Elena. And I'm going to hand the floor to Philippe Luc on the economic impact of immigration on host countries.
Really appreciate all the comments of the speakers before me. Apologize for not speaking in French. You don't want me to speak in French. So I'm an economist by training. I'm an international trade economist who spent my career thinking about trade, migration, and the impacts on labor and labor markets. When I left academia to serve in the last US administration to the State Department, the reason I wanted to do that was because I was getting incredibly frustrated by how clear the evidence was about the benefits of migration and how far away from that our political conversation was. And having been in government, it's even worse than I thought, honestly. Just to hit on a few topics that were raised earlier, I mean, again, Ecuador and Colombia house millions of Venezuelan migrants. Of course, it's not entirely due to US policy, but the extreme or the very strict sanctions policy the US government has imposed is certainly affecting the economic prosperity and economic ability of Venezuela. To hit on the point earlier about the growth in Africa, just to give you two other anecdotes that sort of might cement this, 1 out of every 2 children born over the next 75 years will be born in Africa. Africa is the reason our global population is not declining already. Nigeria will be roughly the same population as China at the turn of the century. Okay, this is a massive increase in population. Now, that doesn't mean that this is going to require massive migration, right? You know, if there's opportunity in these places, economic opportunity, lack of conflicts, lack of, you know, push factors, Africa can have, you know, a century of incredible prosperity. We really are in a situation where the situation is quite stark. We either need to move an enormous amount of people from where there's very little capital to where they can use capital effectively, or we need to invest in capital where people are going to be. Right? Those are kind of our two choices. If you do neither of those, then you're going to get an enormous amount of forced migration, and it's not going to be especially pretty for anybody. So that's the global picture in my perspective. And the value to us, the benefit to us of that migration can, if we do have sort of a pull migration where we sort of, rather than push, where, you know, there's sort of need for that, people leaving places where there's not opportunity, the value of the rest of us can be enormous because we have very much aging populations. We have shrinking labor forces. We will have a lot of people entering a phase of their life where they will need care and support. Beyond the fact that we'll simply need workers. So there's a way we can integrate these into our economies quite successfully. Now I just want to turn to sort of the frustration I had being in the academic world and sort of seeing the factual record and not understanding the conversation where it was. Especially from the US perspective, there's really basically no debate left. Migration is a massive benefit to the United States. It's a massive benefit. It's a large benefit to the sending countries as well. For a very long time, we were pretty worried about sort of brain drain and issues like that. Of course, there's some degree of that, but generally speaking, the benefits to the sending country are quite large too. There's an excellent study that looked at the increase in visas for Philippine nurses. The concern was that this would sort of drain the Philippines of qualified nurses. Well, we did the exact opposite because more people went in to train and become nurses because now there's a huge return to that, right? And you know, of course, there's high remittances from from highly for educated and high earning people who send back to their home countries. And you know, once you have these migration flows, trade flows increase because, you know, a lot of people who go to this new country, they now know about, you know, products from their home country. There's an enormous number of benefits, right? So that's what we're seeing in the United States, or that's the sort of factual record. But of course, what I'm telling you is clearly different from the political reality. We have an administration that is drastically increasing deportations, which my own research indicates not only harms undocumented individuals, but destroys US jobs. We had similar deportation programs, much less extreme, but honestly similar deportation programs under the Obama administration. My own research shows that for every 1 million people you deport, you destroy 88,000 US jobs of citizens as well. Right? So we're going to destroy jobs for American citizens as well, because when you have less construction workers, you need less foremans, you need less sort of US labor as well. And the irony of this, even if you don't care as much about sort of these individual economic arguments, you know, this administration's made it pretty clear we're moving back to an era of sort of hard economic power. You know, this administration seems very interested in weaponizing access to the US market. What is the US market other than the people, right? It's the people who are demanding goods and services. So, you know, from that perspective alone, we're decreasing our benefits. And then lastly, I mean, you know, I don't need to tell anybody this, but historically, immigration has been the US's superpower. It is the thing that drives our country. We're built on it. You know, I am descendant from, you know, Syrian refugees to the United States who within one generation married German immigrants and, you know, were very successful, right? We have had a long track record of that. So where do I want to go from here? Obviously, I'm saying this. is not, there's a disconnect between the factual record and policy, and this is where I really appreciate the first point about, you know, facts are not sort of just these fixed things. They're created around narratives and stories that we tell. I would say a few things. When I went into government for the first time, I was ranting to a civil servant, much like I'm doing right now. And after they quietly listened to me for a little, or patiently listened to me for a while, they turned to me and said, "Phil, I would have expected you would have realized this by now. It doesn't matter that you're right." So the point is, okay, we need to do better than just being right about the facts. We need to understand why that's not reflecting the policies that we have. And we need to understand that there's just a massive value to political fringes and to adversaries of stoking these views about immigrants. I mean, think about Russia. Russia is facing a demographic collapse. It would be in Russia's benefit for Europe to face the same demographic collapse. So you better bet that the propaganda that Russia is going to be feeding Europe is about the harm of immigrants, right? So that's something we need to deal with. We need to be addressing this as the challenge it is, which is not just about facts. Absolutely, facts are important. Absolutely, we need to find ways that the facts will help us design programs that help integration better, help people to mitigate climate crises so that they don't need to migrate as far. But we also need to deal with this not just as an economic problem, which is why I really appreciate the conversation we're having here, but as a conversation around the narratives and the fact patterns that we put in front of us. Thank you.
Merci à vous.
Thank you very much. So we've got 10 or so minutes before we hand the floor back to Hippolyte for the conclusion. But Christopher, I'd like to come back to you to ask you to react to what Philippe Luc has said. He's hoping that Africa will be able to absorb that huge demographic pool. Do you think Africa will manage that? Probably not. Let me just specify something. Phil was right when he was talking about Nigeria's population, and it will be as big as the Chinese population. That's right. However, it's not that Nigeria is going to grow up to 1.5 billion. It's also that China is going to shrink to 600 billion. So Nigeria will be huge. However, the problem is exactly what my colleague has said. It's about climate change. So the Philippines are investing in Africa, or Africa's investing in Europe. There are choices that will be made. We cannot just keep quiet if the Chad Lake dries up. And when we're talking about demographic growth in Africa, I fear that in the equatorial regions, that is where the growth is going to take place. Yes, I can hear what you're saying. I get your message. For years and years, we've been hearing that we have to invest in those countries of origin so people stay there. However, it doesn't work. We've tried for many years. Now, time is scooting on, so Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, I'm turning to you now. The narrative of those people who are hostile to migration, is everything they say wrong? Are they just making it all up? Is it all rubbish? Because this is a narrative that is being translated into the vote. I just want to come back, first of all, on the previous conversation. It was really interesting. I think it was you, Christopher CALDWELL, who've just said that the problem is that with climate change, then the desert is expanding, the Sahel is expanding, and it will be a difficult place to live in. Of course, that's obvious. However, let's not underestimate the fact that resources needed to cope with that are also to be found in Africa. Renewable energy, solar energy, for example, as we can all understand, that's in Africa. And you're right, Philippe, to say that the investments which we make in these countries, these poor countries, because we can't talk about migration without tying it in with how the world economy works. And for the time being, support to the poorest countries gives us the impression that it's not really being very efficient, because we're looking at it through charitable eyes. It's not charity. For these northern countries, they're not being charitable towards southern countries. It's a question of reviewing the world rules of how we fund the economy, of trade laws and rules, which always are damaging to the southern countries. They're detrimental to the southern countries, and they are advantageous to the northern countries. Now, why is this? I'm not saying this because the northern countries are the baddies in this. They're post-colonial, although there might be a grain of truth in that. What I am trying to say is that the institutions of Bretton Woods and all the rest of it, they were all designed at a time when countries in the south were still colonized. And so they did not participate in the conversations, and so their interests were not defended. Today, the commercial rules which are in force are to the advantage of the countries in the north, and they're detrimental to Senegalese fishermen, for example, who are not able to sell their fish, and sooner or later they have no economic possibilities where they live, and so they go elsewhere. So we need to take a look at all of that again. So it's difficult. We've got multilateralism in there. We've got how the world is divided up. But sooner or later, it's the citizens that have to grasp this nettle and make politicians realize that it's very important. Now, let me answer your question. I'm not saying that those who are hostile to immigration are putting the wrong questions or they're not anxious, etc. I'm not saying that. And I am not denigrating. There's questions about security, because security is important. It would be wrong to do so. What I am saying is that all of these questions, are the newcomers going to be a burden on the labour market? Are they going to increase the number of crimes, etc.? Well, all of these questions have been addressed in science and research. Researchers around the globe have examined all of these questions in many different countries. And at the end of the day, if you take the time to read the results, you get the answers in terms of the economy. We know all researchers who've worked on this question will tell you that when a newcomer shows up, even if you give that person some allocation as an asylum seeker, well, that person consumes. He or she will be paying VAT. They will be contributing to national wealth. And if that person can work, they'll pay social contributions. People are always saying that the newcomers do the rubbish jobs that no one else wants to do. But let's keep in mind that it's even better if they could do those higher jobs, those most impressive jobs with a higher salary, because the higher their salary, the more social contributions they will pay. So research has come up with answers to all of these questions, including the question of crime. There is no specific increase in crime when newcomers arrive. However, the media focuses on anyone who carries out a crime with a foreign-sounding name. And so it's all used. We've got a pretty problem with multilateralism here. That is true. I don't know who'd like to answer this question, but I'm sending it out into the ether. Is this debate on chosen immigration is the right conversation to be having? Because you can also say that selected immigration, if it works, it's draining southern countries from their skills. I'd like to take this one. I think this is a very good discussion to be having, because what Philippe mentioned there, immigration is good for the economy, all economies. I think in most cases, in terms of the GDP. However, it may not be true in terms of equality, and that is why immigration is good for the economics, but it's bad for policy. And if we continue along this route, we'll all be ending up with a Trump. And that's what you're looking towards in Europe. So the importance is equality. The problem here is immigration as we know it today worsens inequality because this is low-skilled laborers who are arriving. They are low-cost producers for their bosses. And so that just worsens that difference in equality. If we could attract people with more skills, Nicolas Sarkozy, for example, wanted to use this term chosen immigration to try and settle that question of the inequality.
The perspective from sending countries would be different, right? In terms of what's the impact of out-migration, if it's a very highly skilled, qualified migration, I still think that it's positive if there's this idea of brain circulation, of bringing people back, having young people go and have an experience abroad and work some time there and then come back at a certain point of their lives. I think that would be another way of putting it, and I will finish here so that Philip can also.
Just really quickly, I agree with that. Because you shouldn't think of skills as just this fixed asset. Skills are invested in, and they're only invested in if there's a return to doing that investment. And the ability to work for some amount of time in a country where there's a higher return increases the return to that investment, as is the research I mentioned about the Philippines. So absolutely, and there's benefits beyond that. I would also say, I think the composition of migration that we have as higher income countries is a function of our own policy. There's plenty of high skilled people who'd be happy to come to Europe or the United States or other places if they were allowed to. In the United States, when I was a diplomat, every single country I went to, almost every single one that was a not developed country, the ask was immediately about visas. It was about H-1 visas. It was about skilled labor visas. And so this is entirely within the control of our countries. Now, this might be slightly different for the United States and other places, but it's certainly the case. And then the last thing I would just say is, I think, of course, we need to there's going to be huge shocks to this is coming back to an earlier point. The climate transition or, climate change will create huge shocks to productivity across places. It'll increase it in some places, especially things like solar. It'll decrease it in others. I think we need to make the investments necessary to mitigate those shocks as much as possible. And there are simple ways to do that. I mean, research, in the Americas has shown that even just slightly higher access to remittances, again, which comes from people who are working in the United States, slightly higher access to remittances reduces the need for climate-related just relocation because you have some amount of savings that can get you through periods when you might have to migrate otherwise. So there's outside of broad policies, there's smaller policies that can really impact these as well.
Anjhula pour le mot de la fin, très vite, Anjhula, s'il vous plaît.
Quickly for a final word, Anjhula.
I agree with my fellow panelists. Again, coming to the question, chosen or imposed, chosen. Imposed is almost a narrative of woe to me, look at what they are doing to us. And, in 2025, I find it very interesting that we're talking about migration as if it's this new, scary thing that's taking over. Migration is as old as time. Please, it's just as old as time. What is British? What is French? Let's look at this also from a deeply historical lens. In terms of what President Trump is fond of saying, fake news. This idea that Europe or America is absorbing so much. And by the way, Philip, I really appreciate the humility in which you framed your comments. It's actually developing countries that are absorbing more migration. I don't think we're also having enough conversations about the fact that some people can't migrate even though they do anything for it, i.e. Gaza, internal migration within a country. All I would ask is that all of us, including the audience, ask yourselves, who's telling the story? Who wields the pen? Who wields the mic? Why are they telling the story? What story is being force-fed to you? What story are you telling yourself, because quite often it's a dead cat strategy. Yeah? I'm going to throw the scary migration issue over there to take attention away from institutional and structural neglect. It is not okay to scapegoat a population for political and our leadership failures. So keep asking those questions. There's so much more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Merci à tous. On n'a plus.
Thank you very much. We don't have really much time for a conclusion. Hippolyte, really quickly. Okay, well, it's over then. I just like to come back to the question of France. We are in a situation which is very tricky. We've got a population which is aging, and it's aging for good reasons, because our old age people live for a long time. We're thrilled about that, but it does cost a lot of money. We have to fund their social protection. We also have to make huge efforts in the energy transition. We have to make huge efforts in research, in science, and now, because we've got a crackpot just over the other side of the border, we have to make huge efforts in our defence. What are we going to do? There's no magic wand to wave. The smallest thing that we have to do is to have enough people who are working and have as many people working as possible. We have to be appealing. So we can't just change the migration policy and say that everything's fine. No, we already are in a zone where people can move around freely. We're in Europe. There are 400 million people here, and 12% can come, but people aren't coming. We're not appealing enough. We're not appealing for the very good reason is that we are not very welcoming. The only solution is to welcome, to change our attitudes to people who are born in other countries than our own. Let me take an example, and I'll finish with this. The example, a typical example, is Japan. Formerly, when I was a little boy, it was a huge country. Now it's a country in decline. Take a look at what's happening. We've questioned people in retirement homes, asking them, what would you prefer, to be touched by a foreigner or a robot? They all say they prefer to be touched by a foreigner, not by a robot. They don't want to. If we don't know how to welcome people, we will be in decline, that's absolutely sure. Thank you very much.
Merci. Merci à vous. Très bonne.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of our meeting.